But could it be that the CEO knew that firm performance would have been good anyway? And so she asked the board to give her stock rather than cash. So in order to try to get to causation, what these authors do is they look at whether equity matters more, where the CEO is more likely to influence firm value. So in firms in which there's little institutional monitoring, that's when the CEO could get away with slacking off. When there's little competition or governance, all of these are places in which the CEO could slack off. And it indeed is the case that incentives have a greater effect on firm value in those firms, again, trying to push us towards causation. So based on this evidence, which I do believe is strong, it's not the final word, but I do believe it's a good step. This does suggest that actually stock-based compensation could be something which is creating value. So one of the statements in the paper was there's little overall evidence that the market has yet found meaningful performance targets which really act positively as incentives. So we can't use incentives because there's no measure that we should use to incentivize. And that is true for many professions. That's why many professions don't have pay for performance. Take teachers, for example. You paid a teacher according to the student scores and standardized tests. The teacher will just focus on that. He might not look at sort of teaching ethical values or a respect for authority or a love of learning, just focus on that one measure. But the nice thing with executives is that we do have a comprehensive measure. It would be incorrect to pay bonuses according to sales, because then you won't think about environmental sustainability or corporate culture. Any one of those other measures is going to be incomplete. But the nice thing is that the stock price, in the long run, big caveat I'm going to come back to later, in the long run, the stock price will capture all channels through which the CEO will add value. If you undertake a good restructuring in the long run, that will improve firm value. If you improve profits at the expense of long-term value, in the long run, that will reduce firm value. And even intangible things that the CEO may undertake, they do show up in the long run stock price. For example, what I show in a few papers is that if you treat your employees ethically, this shows up in terms of long-term performance. Companies that treat their workers better, I found, beat the market by 2 to 3% per year over a 28-year period. Customer satisfaction, environmental sustainability, all of these things benefit the firm in the long run. And this avoids a lot of the problems with bonuses. With bonuses, there's ambiguity. Do we pay the bonus according to sales or earnings or profits or some other measure? Here, there is one stock price. Second is the idea of gaming. If you pay the CEO according to sales, the CEO could shirk upon some of the other measures not rewarded. Here again, the stock price, because it is comprehensive, will take away these problems. And finally, Peter's concern of asymmetry is a very important one, right? If you do well, you get a bonus. If you don't do badly, you don't lose. But if you're paid according to stock, if the stock price drops, you're losing $500,000, as was said in the last slide. But there's a big caveat, and that big caveat is in the long run. We know that the stock market is myopic. In the short run, you can do things to pump up the short-term stock price. And here I completely agree with Peter's suggestion that one of the main remedies would be to increase the vesting horizon of equity, perhaps maybe to 7 or 10 years, and perhaps even beyond the tenure of the CEO, so that she has a large incentive to care about her successor. So what I would argue here is that this statement that more general targets such as total shareholder return leads to uncertainty, the executive doesn't know what she must do to deliver. This is true, right, but I don't think this is a downside. Right, it's clear that it's not clear how you are going to increase the stock price. There's many levers that you can pull. But this is the nature of the CEO's job. Well, it's not just there's one thing that you should do to increase the stock price. The CEO should care about environmental stewardship, treating employees ethically, treating customers and suppliers ethically. And what we want is we want a measure to capture all of these. If you just had something based on 1 or maybe 5 targets, you're going to be ignoring all of the other things which are complex about the CEO's job. There's many questions asked for the report. I'm not going to go through all of them just in the interest of time, but just one thing I will say is that you think about the CEO being rewarded for good performance. It's not necessarily down to her, right? There's many other employees in the firm. So one thing you'd like to do is you'd like to benchmark performance for the rest of the industry. And number 2 is while the CEO does gain on the upside, she also loses on the downside. So always the flip side to bonuses for to pay for good performance is punishment for bad performance. Now, bad performance is similarly not necessarily down to the CEO, but since the CEO will lose if the stock price goes down by $500,000 per year, despite it not being just entirely down to her, this is actually symmetric with the fact that she's going to be gaining for good performance.
I'd rather open up to questions, even though I had more things to talk about.
Yes.
So instead, I'm just going to go to my final slide. Just to wrap up, so I think the paper highlights many interesting problems, but doesn't really identify solutions, or sometimes does put some solutions with not so much justification. So one argument is a high fixed salary is a useful starting point, but it's not clear why we want just a high fixed salary. So the nice thing about equity-linked pay is it goes down under poor performance. High salary is protected, even if there's bad performance. So in terms of my potential solutions, we would like to disclose peer group composition, why you are paying that certain quantum, as Peter said, what were your peers and why did you choose those peers, why are they relevant peers? Indeed, in the US, we see this disclosure. To use stock, not options or bonuses, and stock with a long run horizon. Stock does go up if good performance, goes down if bad performance. Increase the vesting horizon of equity so that you're tied to long-term value. And one thing I didn't talk about because of the lack of time is consider paying CEOs with debt as well as equity, because when the CEO has debt, then she won't take excessive risk because the value of that debt will fall if indeed the risk is taken and the company does badly and is bankrupt. Then you're sensitive to that if the CEO is aligned with their holdings. Well, thank you very much for the attention. I look forward to your questions and reactions.
Thank you very, very much indeed. I'm going to come to you in a moment, but given there's a lot there, I just want to give Peter a couple of minutes just to make some, without this turning to a peer group conversation, instant response to what Alex has said.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Alex, for a very interesting presentation here. I was sort of relieved when you said that you agreed with what I'd said, but you were only going to disagree to be contrarian, because I felt that if you were going to say something I couldn't answer, I'm simply going to say, you don't really mean that. But I do think you've thrown down some challenges, and I just want to pick up on one principle and then make one line point after that, which is the definition of fairness. And I think you're probably right that this is something that one sort of assumes that everybody knows what fairness means, and maybe we should be more explicit. To my mind, it's got two elements. Actually, one is definitely the contribution that the person makes. I think that is, that's a starting point. And if they make a contribution, which is a large contribution, they deserve to be rewarded largely. And we have said that actually in the report. And some of the stuff that you mentioned, which will relate to the contribution, efficiency, innovation, CSR, long-term thinking, is part of what we would mean by contribution. So I think that covers off that point. But I think there is another element to this, which we have seen that actually we need to watch, which is whether the chief executives are taking an ever larger slice of the cake. And there has been, as you know, both in this country and in America, a tendency for the multiple to increase. Now I have to say you were quite dismissive about multiples, and this report also is very sceptical about that. But there is a general problem that the slice of the cake has been going up, and I think that is something that the public perceives as very unfair. I just want to say then, right to the last comment you made about debt, that I've always thought this is very interesting. But I have one problem with debt, which is that unlike the equity market, debt markets are not very liquid, and it is quite difficult to get a real valuation of what you're giving over because of the lack of liquidity. And there would be some possibility if you introduce debt of abuse in that. I used to think it would be really good to pay bank executives insubordinated debt, but then I thought, well, this is such a difficult instrument to value the risk is that some of the unscrupulous ones will just fill their boots and walk off to some extent. So I mean, I think this is very interesting to explore, but it's not without dangers.
And just to that point out, I think, and as you mentioned the CEO of Deutsche Bank in your comments, I'm sure he's working extremely hard right now, given current headlines. Right, over to you. There's lots and lots there. Maybe take a couple of comments to get the conversation going. You gentlemen right at the back, if you can just identify yourself.
Sure. Well, my name is Simon Patterson. I run a firm called Feldmeyer, and Alex's next slide is called the CEO Value Index. And I was just intrigued to find out what he was going to say about it, because Peter talks about it in the report, but I just wanted to get a very quick take on it.
Yeah, Alex.
Okay, so the CEO Value Index was something which is trying to look at the value that the CEO has created, divided by how much you're paying him or her. And so what this looks at in this index, and I definitely agree with the general principle behind this, but what they looked at was a ratio. So you take the amount that the CEO is creating divided by how much he's being paid. And I think the relevant number is not the ratio, but the difference between the two. So if you think of, say, some basic argument, right? So let's say there's a CEO which creates which costs £1, creates 1 million of value. The value index is 1 million. The value created is 999,000. A £1 million CEO who creates 1 billion of value, the value index is only 1,000, but you're creating much more value. So in just basic finance theory, the net present value of any investment is the present value, what you get minus the cost, not divided by the cost. And so this is what I would look at here, was the value created minus the cost, not divided. So I completely agree with the principle, look at benefits versus cost, but it's the difference, I think, rather than the ratio, which is what I would argue would be more relevant. Because otherwise then somebody who just costs $1, there's many $1 CEOs would just have very high values just because the denominator is so small. Thank you for the question.
Yes, lady right at the back as well.
I'm Melanie McLaren from the Financial Reporting Council, so I'm responsible for the corporate governance code. I hesitate to make this point, but we work on the basis that transparency will sort of lead to better behaviour and therefore fairness. But I just do wonder sometimes, particularly in respect of remuneration, whether transparency is having a ratcheting effect. It's a bit like the football transfer and everybody wants to say that they're in the top quartile, and the prices just move up. And I wondered if there was a perspective on that.
And we need to attract global talent, and there are global league tables, and the Masters of the University of Davos all comparing, all that kind of stuff. Peter, what do you think of that?
I think that's a very good point, but we are in a situation where it's very difficult to wind the clock back and do all this in secret. I think there would be even less trust, and I used to be more in favour of that argument until now, some years ago. It was discovered that Dick Grasso of the New York Stock Exchange, whose pay was not actually disclosed, and therefore he wasn't transparent, was quietly pocketing $180 million a year. And actually, I think that is the risk that you get if you row back on transparency. I think the issue actually is more for the remuneration committees to have the courage to tailor what they're giving to the person and their sort of experience. I think I refer to this in this report, the experience of National Grid, which is replacing the chief executive with somebody who's worked for the company since entering as a graduate trainee, and whose starting salary is substantially below the salary of the person who is retiring, because he has less experience of being a CEO. Now that remuneration committee has actually taken his situation and applied some judgments to it which do involve fairness, because he is not getting as much as somebody who was more experienced. This takes quite a lot of courage, because the going rate is always going to be very high. And so I think it's possible. I think it is something that we would counsel chief executives to do. Also, I think sometimes you do have to dismiss these fears that people are going to flounce off. And I remember when I started in the ABI, they were all going to go to America. And I thought, no, you're not, because first of all, you're not going to get visas, and secondly, you're just not good enough. And, you should actually be prepared, I think, sometimes to resist the sort of pressure that comes from here, because it's unreasonable.
Yeah, let's just maybe. I said at the outset, is there anything we can kind of learn from international experience, and is there anything going on elsewhere, Alex, in your mind? We're here in London, we're in the heart of the city today, where we haven't talked about the buy side yet. We'll maybe talk about the buy side in a second in terms of the debate you were having on the Today programme earlier, Peter. But are you seeing anything different, better elsewhere?
Yeah, so I lived in the US for 10
Yes.
years, and so recently, I think it was since 2006, there's been much greater transparency on a number of dimensions. So one of these is pension compensation, which used to be extremely hidden, and so CEOs could give themselves large amounts of pensions, and as Peter was suggesting, nobody knew how much this was worth. So now what they're doing is actually providing much greater disclosure. What are the actual assumptions given to come up with the value of the pensions and so forth. Another one of them is the disclosure of peer groups. So in order to justify a given quantum of pay, who were the peer groups? Why did you choose that certain peer group composition? And I agree with the suggestion that transparency is useful, because one of the concerns with the regulation is that it's one size fits all. So if you were to say the CEO should never get paid more than £1 million, that might be binding in some cases and it might not be in other cases. Instead, by allowing boards and shareholders to set pay optimally for that particular circumstance, then they can adapt to the conditions. And then by being transparent, people can see, are the arguments that they use, do they make sense? Because it might be that they don't, but by being transparent as to what led to the decision, we can perhaps act. And so one of the things that I'm involved in is I'm sometimes expert witness in some of these legal trials in the US where people have been transparent about directors' pay, and we believe that these arguments are just inappropriate. Like, they've disclosed their peer group, but their peer group is much larger than the actual company, and so we're actually suing for some damages and for changes to the remuneration policy in order to address those problems. So by being transparent, you let people evaluate for themselves, do the arguments make sense, and if they don't, they can act against this.
I've always really liked Alex, particularly when he's going to be my expert witness, I have to say. Yeah. I think I'll call on Peter on that one too. That's fascinating. Go on. Yes, gentlemen, just at the window there. Yeah.
I'm Henry Irving from the ICAEW. I guess I'm going to use the sort of C word here, the sort of compensation.
Ooh.
I guess my question is around compensation for loss of office. Now, it does seem to me that the media doesn't pick up on this kind of thing, the golden parachutes that some chief executives get, even when they have to resign for having done something wrong. And I was just wondering whether speakers had views around what should be done, might be done about this, either by remuneration committees or through the employment contracts, or maybe even as a matter of law.
Yeah. Okay. So the golden goodbye, is that essentially feature about just making the problem go away?
Well, I think this problem is much less serious than it used to be, partly because the contracts have changed, and so the ability to pay for failure and the expectation that you will pay for failure is less. There is a bit of a problem here, I think, in that you will find situations where companies employ a chief executive who's not really delivering, and where maybe they feel the strategy the chief executive has got is not really quite right for the company, and they want to part company, but they haven't actually, the people haven't done anything wrong. And I think there is an element here of needing to buy them out, and that's why you will see people who've just not done very well, or sort of not really been able to agree with their board, leaving with a year's pay. That does seem a lot, I think, to the public, but it is not as sort of as egregious payment for failure that we used to see. And I think it is one of these things which is quite difficult to deal with, to tell you the truth. But one where, again, I think the remuneration committees can help by having a very firm sense in their own minds of what is actually fair.
I thought he would. Alex has a slide.
Okay, thank you. So I agree with Peter that this problem is one which is actually been attenuated over time, and so the actual payment that the CA receives for failure is much smaller than what is actually reported. So often in the term severance pay, as we see reported in many news articles, this thing contains many things that the CEO would have got under any state of nature. So these were not given because the CEO lost the job and you're compensating her for the loss of the job. But these were due in any state of nature. These are like unvested restricted shares, unexercised stock options, and accrued pension benefits. These were things that we'd have been given anyway. So if you think of just one high-profile example, Henry McKinnell was given apparently $180 million when he left Pfizer. This was not a reward for failure. So 78 million was deferred compensation. So he'd chosen to defer some of the compensation rather than getting it up front, and were deferred compensation just outlawed, he would have got a higher salary up front. Some of it was pension, some of it was vesting of stock options. So 11 million out of this was severance rather than 180 million. This is still a large amount of money, right? But we still want to get the figures right before we try to look at solutions. There might also be an argument, why did he need so much deferred compensation and pensions? And that would be another important argument, why was the quantum so high? Right, so these are the important things to pick up, but it wasn't that this was paid for failure. He was given this under every state of nature, and so just actually diagnosing the magnitude of the issue, I think, is the first step towards looking at the optimal value.
Sorry, this is completely off piece, but I'm just, I don't know if any of you spotted this, but I'm very conscious, as you've been talking, Alex, this morning, every time you've talked about a CEO, you've said she. Have anyone else picked up on that?
Yeah.
I mean, I can understand why, but it's, of course, it's an interesting debate in terms of where we are right now. Would this debate, there's three blokes, unfortunately, on this panel, we should have got that right, we'll sort that in a minute. But would this debate would we be constantly having this debate in this way if boards properly reflected society? Alex first.
So you're saying if there's just greater composition of
if there was better composition, I mean, you've said quite deliberately, every time you've said CEO, you have said she this morning. And there's a huge debate about where we are on that right now. Certainly there's a wider debate in terms of non-executive representation and executive representation, which is quite rightly taking place. Would this debate be any different?
So I'll look at what I see to be the closest evidence as to what would happen, and unfortunately this evidence is not very comforting. So what people looked at was the effect of the Norway law,
yes,
where they now require 40% of the board of directors, yes, to be women. And so what they used was a treatment group and a control group. So the control group were firms that were already in compliance with this, and the treated group were the ones which were not in compliance, they needed to change after the law. And what they found was that the ones which needed to increase to the 40%, they suffered a loss in firm value and loss in profitability and so forth. But this doesn't mean that female directors are bad. It could just have been that there was a relatively short supply. So it could, if you had another rule saying that everybody, so 10% of directors have to be from Reading, which is my hometown, right? The firm value would go down just because there's not enough supply of this. So this doesn't necessarily mean that actually people from Reading would be bad directors.
I'm thinking David Brent to meet you.
Well, I think Annie G or something. But what this says is that we don't want to mandate this. So there may be many cases in which diversity does matter. And there's evidence on diversity in many dimensions mattering on the board. But if we mandate this, then we might have some problems because there's a...
Yeah, good. Peter, quickly. Yeah.
I think there's a lot of danger in generalisation here. But the Norwegian experience is interesting, but in only a limited way, I think. I think the study was the University of Michigan, is that what you're referring to, which actually had some perverse outcomes because it showed that, in fact, the firms became more risky, partly because they had a lot more inexperienced directors on, not because they were women, but because they had inexperienced directors on. And so it wasn't a panacea. But I think that Norway is a dangerous case to take as an example because this was done very quickly. They were obliged to transform their boards in a very short period, otherwise they would have to disband companies. And that's not the right way to do it. We've done a rather different thing in this company. We've tried to actually have a more gradual approach, which is working, I think, and making some difference. Now, there is some other studies which show that actually when women do get on the board, jobs, they tend to be more inclined to challenge on pay and less entrepreneurial, so that they will be driving less the risk-taking part of the business and more sort of holding, looking at the sort of controls aspect. I mean, I think that's interesting, but I also am not sure that it tells us very much about the generality, because I actually feel, and I remember when this came up, the study, talking to Sarah Hogg about it, who was then chairing the FRC where I then worked, and she said, you mustn't stereotype. She said, my daughter is an entrepreneur. She doesn't think like a sort of controlling woman who's got a chair of the remuneration committee and is determined to hold everything back. People are people. I mean, I think diversity is a very good thing. And I think what you're saying reminds us of the need for it, but I don't think we should be too dogmatic or too determined to have one answer or another.
Great, lots of debate spotlight. I thought it would. So I'm going to take firstly the lady just by the curtain in the corner.
Okay, Leslie Knox, Chairman of Remco's, all sorts of execs, CEO. I'm slightly disappointed that we are continuing to focus on CEOs. I would say for a number of the things we've talked about, actually what would change is if we reflected the fact that many big businesses, it is a senior executive group. We focus much more on that, and we focus much more on whether the CEO is taking too big a share of the pie against the executive group, and is therefore, if anything goes wrong, is in the spotlight to be fired, which is very often not good for the company. But equally, to your point about women, if we focused on senior management, actually I think that would be a better test of whether women are coming through. There are very few CEOs of companies. The really important thing is that management group. Yet again, we are only talking about CEOs.
That's right. Let me do a group because we're running out of time. And the lady just at the back again in the glasses.
It was just a very...
Sorry, if you can say who you are.
Sorry, yes. Scarlett Brown, I'm at Grant Thornton, I'm also doing a PhD at King's looking at women on boards. And I was just going to make a very quick point on to what extent women are challenge greater on pay. And there's lots of questions about, do they need greater challenge, are they more risk averse? There's a really interesting core of research about that women operate under what's called a glass cliff. And actually, because of the high pressure to get women onto boards and the expectations about what they'll do when they get there, that they end up being put under quite a lot of scrutiny, which means that the decisions that they make, so to the extent to which they challenge, etc., are more visible to the kind of wider perspective, and that puts them in quite difficult positions.
So there's a sort of hedging of going further.
And a big focus on the decisions that they make that therefore affects their ability to be. So what my point was going to say, if you had 50-50, or you had more like 3 or 4 women on the board, the fact that they might be challenging would potentially change, because their ability to make decisions as a director rather than the woman on the board gets affected.
Yeah, very interesting. And I'll take the gentleman in the front there as a third.
Thank you. John Williams, IBE trustee. I just want to ask, slightly outside this sort of bubble almost, about the impact on society of these decisions, because the one thing I've heard today is the quantum isn't going to go down anytime soon, and given we've had lots of issues about the gap between the 1% of the 99 and the haves and haves not, leading perhaps to President Trump and Prime Minister Corbyn, how much is this debate responsible for that?
That's a very, very good point, John. So maybe if I can start with you first, Angela, and actually on the quantum issue, on the league table issue that came up earlier, John McDonnell from the Labour Party has been out there really since the start of the year, both playing into the tax debate, but actually playing into the pay debate as well. Alex, CEOs only the cliff idea that is out there as well, and actually, frankly, the broader context of the wider debate right now.
Sure, I'll just start with the first point, and I completely agree. So the points that we talk about don't need to just apply to CEOs, they also apply to executives, they could also apply to rank and file employees. So this idea of paying somebody a bonus, which for long-term performance is important for a rank and file employee in They want to make some underwriting decisions of subprime loans which are going to blow up in a few years. We want to link pay to long-term performance. So absolutely there's ways through the organisation. The point on the impact on society is very important. So why should we care about the effect of society on society? Two reasons: efficiency and fairness or equality. So in terms of efficiency, it's not clear that the government needs to get involved. Right? Pay is a private contract between shareholders and the firm. There's many other decisions that firms make that affect society, their choice of mergers, their choice of investment decisions, their choice of dividend policy and capital structure. But it seems to be, for some reason, that we want to get involved in pay, which affects firm value to a much smaller amount than all of these other things. Number two is that even if there's no efficiency argument, then there's a fairness argument, is that just leads to income inequality. And I agree with this, but this is not related to just CEO pay. There's other highly paid professions, such as, say, lawyers or hedge funds or sports stars or music stars. So if we think about income inequality as being a concern, we want to address not just CEO pay, but pay of other highly paid individuals, and that might be something that the tax system will be addressing, because that would address all highly paid individuals, whereas just affecting CEO pay would not solve those other issues. And that's a good point from the lady in the back about sort of when there's 3 women on board rather than 1, they might be more effective.
The parallels around tax, around fairness, around the league tables on when in this calendar year Google stopped paying tax compared to the ordinary taxpayer. The parallels are really, I think, strong as we move into 2016. Peter.
Yes, the inequality question first. I actually do think there's a problem because I think the perception, as we've I think agreed, it's very difficult to measure the exact ratios, but there's certainly they've been going up, or they have gone up over the years, and there is a perception of unfairness, and there is an issue around inequality. And I think this is one reason why companies actually need to get to grips with this, because unless they can show that the means of delivery is fair and actually justified to the public, they're going to find the public will rise up and smack them in the face. And I don't think we will be having the same debate next year if Prime Minister Corbyn is Prime Minister. And that's going to be very bad business. So it's in the business's own interest to get this system working in a way that commands public respect. You can't cut the quanta. They're there, but you can make the whole thing, I'm sorry to use the vague term, more fair. Now the other. Leslie, I want to pick you up on what you said, because I agree with you absolutely. One of the reasons for the focus is because that's where the vote is, and that's where the disclosure comes. And I think that's probably a bad thing, and a bad thing about the way that the regulations handle this requiring vote. But we are where we are, and it has been a focus. I would say, though, that my own personal sense is a collegiate approach in the top executive is a good idea. I'm writing something else at the moment where I suggested this, and one of the reviewers has struck it out with red ink and said sometimes you want a strong chief executive. So it doesn't, you can't always have it. It depends on the company.
I think we may not have Prime Minister Corbyn, but the interesting thing right now is how Osborne in particular wants to triangulate. Yeah, so the non-dom policy, the living wage policy. There is a voter effect that even a right of centre, you're hearing it from Trump, my goodness, a right of centre politician will also want to grab onto. Now I saw Richard Cox, so any other, so Richard first, and then the gentleman again at the back with his hand up. Richard first.
So Richard Cox from HSBC. So kind of links into the previous question about senior managers. Obviously, financial services introducing a new senior managers regime where there's an explicit responsibility on risk and compliance functions to oversee the performance appraisal process for senior management. I'd just be interested in your views in terms of whether that is likely to be an effective control. I think certainly you don't want to see a situation where senior managers get penalised for taking risk, but essentially I think that oversight could introduce the idea where risk is not a bad thing, but poorly taken risk is penalised, and therefore having a second line oversight could actually encourage risk, providing it's done with the right mitigations in place, with your eyes open to the risk, such as that the outcome for the company and for customers is managed.
And the senior manager regime was a specific political ask, more than anything else. Yes.
Just a question inspired.
So, if you can see who you are.
Luke Hilliard and I work for the Pensions and Lifetime Savings Association. Question inspired by the gentleman's point about reputation. One of the sort of policy solutions that's always proposed to this perceived problem is a role for elected workers' representatives on remuneration committees. One thing that I think particularly appeals to people about that is that it is the multiple difference between the CEO and the ordinary worker that particularly I think sticks in the craw of the public. If the company in question could then come back and say, yes, the CEO is paid 200 times the average worker, but we've consulted with the workforce on this, their representative is party to signing off on the policy that's awarded that, they're happy because he's a good CEO, keeping them in a job and making it a good place to work. That sort of negates one of the sort of biggest criticisms. So I'd just like to know what Peter and Alex think about that.
Very good point. So Alex first, you said private contract, public responsibility.
Okay, I'll just respond to the second point, just because I know I have more about I know more about it than the first point. Not that the first point is unimportant; it is just my research is more than the second. So my concern with having workers' representatives is that might just lead to changes in the optics of pay. So the easiest to disclose dimensions,